Welcome, everybody. We're so happy to be back learning with you all and with Rabbanit Sara Wolkenfeld. This is the second of three classes with the title Angels Amongst Us. So this class was rescheduled after starting earlier in this month. So just to give a brief introduction, angels play a major role in biblical and rabbinic literature. Who are they? What do they have to do with our spiritual and religious aspirations? This series will explore aspects of the Jewish relationship with angels. Rabbanit Sara Wolkenfeld is the Chief Learning Officer at Sara, an online database and interface for Jewish texts. I'm sure we all know and love Sara. She's also a fellow at the David Hartman Center at the Hartman Institute of North America. She studied Talmud and Jewish law at various institutions of Jewish learning in Israel and America, including Midreshet Lindenbaum, Drisha, Nishmat, and Beit Morasha, and speaks on various Jewish topics at synagogues, schools, and university communities. Over to you, Rabbanit. Welcome.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate it. I'm really excited to resume our discussion of angels tonight. I'm sorry that it's been a while, but in recognition of that gap, I am dedicating our learning tonight in memory of my sister, Zvara Chava Bat Melech, who passed away about 4 weeks ago. And I although it was for a very valid reason, but I'm sorry that we haven't gotten to learn for a while. And this is an exciting topic. I feel like my sister would have been interested. So I'm glad to be back with you and glad to be back learning with you. And because it has been a little while, I want to recap a little bit of what we talked about all those weeks ago, and then use that as a jumping off point for a further discussion of angels tonight. So to start with a reminder, we're using what I would call a big tent definition of angels. There's a lot of different terminology for angels or various types of angels. There's melachim, seraphim, ofanim, malachei hasharit, just to list some of the Hebrew names. It doesn't matter whether or not those words ring a bell for you, but just to acknowledge that there are a lot of different names that are used in biblical and rabbinic literature to refer to angels. Sometimes actually angels are just referred to as people in the Torah, and only later on do we find out they were actually angelic figures. So this is our big tent definition. We assume that the word angel is kind of all-encompassing of all of these forms in some way or other, recognizing that they've had different names and really different roles in different parts of Jewish textual history. And also assuming that the word malach is derived from the word melacha, which I think is, like, for me, a fun kind of guidepost to keep in mind. The word melacha, which means work, which we perhaps most associate with things that are forbidden on Shabbat, melacha, the 39 categories of labor that are forbidden on Shabbat. So you could say all 39 of those and more are the stuff of angels. They have work to do, they have missions, they have things to accomplish in the world. We talked last time about how angels are similar to and also different from people. So there are moments that the Talmud identifies when we might try to imitate the angels, like putting our legs together in prayer, or trying to be angelic, the Talmud says, when we teach Torah. And then there are other times when people are clearly contrasted with angels. The Gemara explicitly says, well, there are ways in which we're similar and there are ways in which we are different. And what I want to do tonight is to think about kind of taking that dichotomy to the next stage and really focusing on, what does this dichotomy mean? What happens when we compare ourselves to the angels? And particularly, what does it mean to have a rivalry with the angels? We also looked last time at the idea that maybe we, human beings, were created in the image of angels, and that when the verse in the book of Genesis in Sefer Bereshit says, Na'aseh Adam b'tzalmenu kidmutenu, God says, let us make humans in our image. Maybe the we there is not God speaking in the royal we, maybe it is actually the angels. And at the end of our last session, we looked very briefly at some sources that that again tap into this idea of, okay, what's the point of this dichotomy that celebrate our humanity? And we're going to circle back to those sources at the end of this class. So if you don't remember, or if you weren't there, that's fine. I want to circle back to them at the end of this session with a new perspective after we have some time again to think about this rivalry, really. And that's the focus of this session tonight. I called it Wrestling with Angels, Angels versus the Jewish People. My questions are, what happens when the Jewish people go up against the angels? What do we gain from this rivalry, particularly if we win? So again, if the last class was thinking about how are we like the angels, how are we different from the angels? Once we've established some of those differences, what does it mean to be in tension with the angels? Where do we feel it? Where do we locate that? And again, what do we gain from that, if anything? I want to also remind you, and then we'll dig in, that at the bottom of this source sheet that I'm going to share with you in a moment, maybe I will share that actually. I'll put that in the chat so you can see it. So one of the problems with teaching about angels is that there's so much amazing material, and also so much material that is really not actually so relevant, but just once you start kind of free associating angels, there's just so much there. And I was reminded of songs about angels and poetry about angels, not Jewish in particular, but just so many resonances around the word angel that I think are live for us sometimes, whether we realize it or not. They're ideas or images that come to mind when we start thinking about angels. And I wanted to have a space to call all of that up, to not totally lose it in the flow of Jewish texts. And so at the bottom of the sheet that I just shared, I have a space for what I call angel graffiti. Maybe you'll suggest a better name for it, but it's all the other things about angels that I thought about, and not all of them yet. I'm slowly adding, but that is a collaborative space, and you're welcome to add anything that you think of that you associate with angels. And of course, you're also always welcome to put comments or questions in the chat if you have questions or comments, anything to add on the theme of angels, and of course about these specific texts as we dig in. So with that in mind, let's get started. Again, I shared the source sheet, and if you don't see it, just put a comment in the chat and someone will share it with you. One of the I guess the first, or the kind of original locus for the rivalry between humans and angels is creation. According to the Midrash, this sense of competition, which is really widespread in rabbinic literature, the idea that we are somehow in competition with the angels, it's going to be a battle to decide who's better, who's superior. That started from the very beginning, from the moments of creation. We might have already an instinctive sense that angels predate people. In other words, that angels existed in the world in some way, even before people were created. And that's supported by the Midrashim that we learned together last time, that talk about angels being the audience for God's statement that we should create humans. There are a number of other Midrashic sources that portray the angels as being they were the naysayers. They were like the peanut gallery when God was saying to God's self, maybe we should create human beings. The angels were the ones saying, stop, wait, no, don't do it. And I want to look at that discourse a little bit. And again, with an eye towards thinking together with you about why. What is it that the angels didn't want about human creation? And why were we created despite angelic objections? Like, why is that important? Why would the Midrashim tell us this story? So I'm going to share my screen so we can look at these together. This first Midrash is one of my favorites, and I actually put it on the sheet last time, but I want to spend a little bit more time inside of it this time. Amar Rabbi Simon, b'sha'a sheba HaKadosh Baruch Hu livrot et Adam harishon. So Rabbi Simon says, at the moment when God came to create the first human being, na'asu malachei hasharet kitim kitim v'chaburot chaburot. The angels broke up into small groups. Mehem omrim al yibara, umehem omrim yibara. Some of them were saying, don't create humans, and some of them were saying, no, go ahead and create the humans. And according to this Midrash, the factions broke down along a kind of almost along political lines. It depended not on your political party, but where you stood on the creation of human beings depended on the midah, the character trait with which you were associated. And so there's a pasuk, there's a verse in Psalms, kindness and truth met, righteousness and peace touched. And the midrashic understanding of that is chesed omer yibareh, the attribute of chesed, of loving kindness, said, go ahead, create a human being, shuhu gomel chasedim, because people are kind. People have the capacity to be kind to each other. The emet omer, but truth said, al yibareh, shekulo shkarim. Truth said, no, don't create human beings because they are entirely filled with lies. And then you have a similar exchange between righteousness, who says, yeah, go ahead, create the human beings, they do good things. Shalom omer al yibareh, and then the attribute of peace says, no, don't create people. Dechulei ktata. They're all, they're just arguments all the time. If I asked you which one of these statements is true about human beings, you could answer that if you want, but I think you would tell me they're all true. You're right, and you're also right. It's true. People are capable of great acts of kindness, and people also don't always tell the truth, or maybe incapable of telling the full truth even to themselves sometimes. And people can be righteous, and people also create a world that is not necessarily full of peace. And so the dramatic denouement of the story is Me'asa HaKadosh Baruch Hu. What did God do? Natal emet v'hishlicho la'aretz. God cast truth to the ground, and there's a verse to support this. And the angels were kind of upset by this, but the Midrash goes on to say, like while the angels were back and forth arguing with each other, until they were finished arguing with each other, it was a done deal. God did it while their backs were turned, right? It's like what you do, your kids are busy like fighting over the last cookie, and that's when you pull out the donuts. So they were busy, they were fighting, and God says, what are you arguing about? I already made human beings. The angels couldn't agree on whether it was a good idea or not, and God went ahead and did it anyway. And Noah is reflecting that angels as haters is such a wild idea. I think it is, because again, this is part of my idea of this like angel graffiti sheet that I think often certainly in like modern Western culture, angels are angelic. They're all good. And in being portrayed here as the angels that are opposed to human creation, they're fearful. What are they fearful of? They're fearful of the worst sides of humanity. Again, you have to give them credit where credit is due. They're not wrong about people, but somehow it does seem very, they're opposed to our creation. It does kind of seem really hateful, and there's something really unappealing, I think, about the angels in this story. And Noah also said, this reminds me of the idea that chen is when we favor someone because we only see what we like or relate to in them. That's really interesting. I think the point there is that the angels like the parts that mimic their attributes and can't stomach the parts that don't, right? The non-angelic parts of humans are the parts that the angels really can't handle. So one more story, also about creation, with same idea but a slightly different focus. So this one is in the Gemara in Sanhedrin, and here it's the same basic setup. God is seeking to create humans. So what does God do? God creates one group of angels and says to them, how would you feel about making some angels in our image? What do you think about doing that today? So they say, well, tell us about these people. What are they going to be like? God tells them, and they say in verse form, in quoting a verse from Psalms, what is man that you are mindful of him, and the son of man that you think of him? Like, why would you do such a thing? In this version of the story, as soon as they say that, God puts, as it were, God's little finger into their midst and burns them up. God destroys that group of angels. And this is then repeated with more and more groups of angels, a second group of angels. And then the third group says, listen, God, you are not, this is not a real question. You are not really asking us this question. You burned up the first two groups. It's your world. Do what you want. And when they get to, when human history gets to the Dor HaFlaga, gets to the generation of the Tower of Babel, the angels say, I'm scrolling so that you can see the English on the screen, but you have the Hebrew and the English there, both. Yeah, okay, don't you get it now, God? You really shouldn't have created them. Interesting that it's the Dor HaFlaga, it's the Tower of Babel where this is located and not the story of Noah. But at any rate, God says, yeah, okay, you have a point. But essentially God says, it's a pasuk, it's portrayed as God quoting this verse from Yeshayahu, V'ad zikna anihu, v'ad seva ani asbol. I'll deal with it. I'll suffer people even into old age. I'm willing to tolerate a lot for the sake of humanity. Essentially, the angels, again, are not saying anything that's not true about human beings. Human beings, I think we can all agree, are not angels in the conventional angelic sense of the word angels, maybe not the way they're portrayed in these stories. Human beings are not perfect. We're really not. We're not all that. The angels are resistant to us and to our creation for that very reason. And God's pretty comfortable with it all. God is saying, okay, it's true. They're not perfect. They're not so great. And nonetheless, there's value in their creation. In the first story, maybe clear value because there are some positive attributes that they can uphold. And in the second story, it's not even really clear what God gets out of it or what we contribute to the world. But in both cases, God kind of wins the argument and people are ultimately created. So I'll ask again in case anyone wants to share either in comments on Facebook or on Zoom, what's the value of claiming that the angels are opposed to the creation of human beings? And why were we created? Or what do these stories say about why we're created despite the angelic objections? I think these midrashim are telling us something about angels, for sure, but also about who we are in the world vis-a-vis angels. So if anyone wants to put a comment in, I'll pause and take a sip of coffee, and I'm happy to share my thoughts as well. Okay, so if anything comes in on the chat, again, please feel free to share your thoughts. I think first of all, that the idea that we were never going to be perfect, that there was no, what we would call in Gemara, Havamina, there was no thought, even from the beginning, God never defends humankind by saying, no, angels, don't worry, they're going to be perfect. It seems really built into the design that we are not going to be perfect, and it's not something that we are, in some ways, kind of meant to aspire to. And Lily Naz adds that it shows how wanted and loved we are by God, but it's not because we're necessarily so great, it's unconditional love. And I think that's really my interpretation here as well. There's something that much more special about the relationship between human beings and God if God fought so hard to get us created, and if it wasn't because we were going to be the best, it wasn't because we were going to top the angels. Noah has, I'm keeping my baby vibe. That's not an angel song that I thought of. I do have other angel song lyrics though in the graffiti documents if you're interested. So I think that is an important message that Chazal are giving us here in this midrash and in this piece of Gemara, that there's something really essential about humanity. We fill a role in the world that the angels can't fill. And yet I think there's something interesting. You could have accomplished maybe some of that, or maybe even all of that, in a different way. And I think there's something also very human about this idea of a rivalry that tells me that maybe we've always had this idea that there is perfection out there to be had if we just work hard enough, and we'll be more loved, we'll be more worthy if we could just be perfect. And that perfection is kind of located in the angels, but as I think, sometimes happens in like sitcoms and stuff, right? The boring one is also kind of, or the perfect one is also kind of boring and mean in some ways. It's like the yeah, I feel like it's like like a book or movie stereotype. There's the one who's perfect, the one who does everything right, and nobody likes her at the end of the day. And that's how it is with the angels in these stories. We're not set up to love these angels. These are not like fluffy cloud angels, and they're not even sort of beautiful, majestic angels. They're the angels who are so busy, and I love that image in this first piece from the Midrash. They're so busy fighting with each other that they don't even notice. And God's like, oh, by the way, you missed it. I created humankind. Like, minor detail, right? In case you missed it, I created humanity. And so we were never going to be perfect from the beginning. And we have the angels as a kind of foil to our imperfection. But again, the take-home message is not so great to be perfect. It's like lo mashahu, right? We don't think necessarily so highly of this kind of perfection. And as Liliana has said, we were created precisely for the reason that you mentioned, that we were beloved by God. We have a purpose in this world. That purpose is not perfection per se. Another locus of tension between human beings and angels, according to, I think there are probably even more midrashim here than there are about creation, is the moment of revelation. It's the moment when Moshe got the Torah from God as a kind of gift. There's a lot of imagery around God had the Torah. We'll see it a little bit in the sources. God had the Torah, God had this great gift, and God chose to give it to the Jewish people. And of course, there's a whole other discourse about God choosing to give it to the Jewish people rather than to any other people. But it turns out that it wasn't only the other nations with whom we were in competition to get the Torah. We were also in some ways competing against the angels. So there's a sense that the Torah as a corpus, as an object, predates revelation. It was like it's like a thing hanging out in heaven. I don't know, you could picture it as like the Hanukkah presents that you stash away in the closet before you let everybody see them. And it was a coveted object, and the ones doing the coveting were primarily the angels. And so there's a crazy story. I think it's a crazy story. You can tell me what you think. In the Midrash in Shemot Rabbah, when the Torah says that Moses went up to God, Allah el Elokim, Moses went up to God to get the Torah. At that moment, the ministering angels sought to harm Moses, maybe even to kill Moses. What did God do? God changes Moses' face, disguises Moses so that he looks like Abraham. Why? Amar lahem HaKadosh Baruch Hu, Yatem mitbaishin himenu, lo zehu shiradatem etzlo v'achaltem b'toch beito. Aren't you ashamed of yourselves, angels? How could you attack this nice man, Abraham? You yourselves went down to hang out with him. You were hosted in Abraham's home, right? Hearkening back to the stories in Genesis, in Sefer Breshit, of the angels coming to Abraham again, they're described first as people, actually. But they came, they were hosted, they were fed, right? How dare you? Aren't you afraid? Aren't you ashamed of yourselves to be going after Abraham? But it's all a ruse. It's all a ruse because actually this is Moshe. And in the moment, it seems that the way that God thought of to protect Moshe was to say, this is Abraham. And I think it's an interesting, kind of an interesting role for Abraham to play. You might know that rabbinic sources are have a whole separate tension over the idea of the avot and the imahot, these patriarchs and matriarchs who are great heroes of ours. Like, how could it have been that they existed pre-Matan Torah, that they existed before the Torah? Like, did they have the Torah? Did they not have the Torah? The kind of famous debate. There are parshanim, there are commentators who go out of their way to prove that really, even if they hadn't gotten the Torah yet, that the patriarchs and matriarchs somehow knew all of Torah. So Abraham is this kind of, he's like a neutral figure in this story. Not just that like you were hosted in his house, but like he clearly can't hurt you. Like he didn't actually have the Torah, and he was still this great person, but he's like a neutral figure in this drama. But Moshe had to be disguised as Abraham because had the angels realized that this was someone new, someone who was coming to take the Torah, they would have gone through with it. Maybe they would have really killed Moshe. That's the extent to which they didn't want humans, they didn't want the Jewish people to get the Torah. And I think actually it sort of begs the question of, okay, why? Why did they want the Torah so badly? Why didn't they want us to have it? First of all, it's a little bit of an aside, but I'll say that separately, that I sometimes teach a class about ownership of the Torah. And so I think this is a very interesting moment in terms of that. Like, it's not necessarily intuitive to me that because I have Torah, you can't have it. And in fact, I would say that sources, that rabbinic tradition kind of goes back and forth on that. Like, on the one hand, Torah is expansive enough to belong to everybody. On the other hand, it's this like very finite gift that can only be given to one person or one group and not other people. So there's that, right? There's this sense in the story that it's a finite resource that you have to be careful about. And then I think also this larger question, right? And so the question is like, is that really true? And then this larger question, why are the angels so opposed to us getting it? That question is not answered in this story. Although if you have answers, I'm very curious to hear them. Shir HaShirim Rabbah, a similar but different midrashic tradition, talks also. I didn't give you it's a long citation here. You can click on the header and look it up in Sefaria if you'd like. But the context is, again, talking about Moshe going up to Mount Sinai, going up to God, going up to the heavens, according to the rabbinic tradition, to get Torah, or to get the Torah, right, to get the tablets, and the angels being opposed. And the rabbis say it's analogous to, it's similar to Melech Shemasi Bito Chutz LaMedina, and a king that's marrying off his daughter outside the country where they live. And the people in the place, Amru B'nei HaMedina, they say to him, Adonenu HaMelech, Shivchachahu, Uvedinhu Sheteheh Bitcha Etzlacha B'Medina. They say, God, this, in this case, king, right? This is your praise, right? This is your daughter. This is your praise. It makes sense that you would be with your daughter, like you have to be in the same place as her. Amar lahem v'chi ma achpat lachem? Why do you care? The king says back to them, and they say, well, if you're marrying your daughter outside of where we live, maybe you're going to follow her. Maybe you're going to leave us. And the king says, no, don't worry. I'm going to marry off my daughter to someone outside this state, but I'm going to continue to live with you. And the nimshal, the meaning of this story, according to this midrash, so too, when God said, I'm going to give the Torah to the Jewish people, you know, those people, they're like people, and they live like down there, not where we live. So the angels got anxious and said, wait, maybe that means essentially that you're going to leave us. You're not going to stay with us. We want you to remain in heaven with us. And they said, perhaps tomorrow you'll rest your divine presence on the lower worlds. And God gave them a bracha, actually, and said, no, don't worry. I'm giving my daughter with her marriage contract, right? So the Torah here is analogous to the daughter. I think that's also interesting in terms of this question of ownership and non-ownership. I'm doing that. So that she'll be honored and appreciated with her husband in her beauty and in her loveliness, because she's the daughter of a king, and they're going to honor her. But I'm staying with you. In other words, God says, yeah, the Torah is this very precious, presence, and that presence, that Torah, the Torah who's gendered female here, she's going to live among the people. She's going to embody all of this greatness and all of this glory and all this pleasantness. She's going to live in the world, and I'm staying with you in the upper worlds. And so according to this midrash, the problem is, again, like almost a petty angelic concern. They're worried that they're going to not have God's attention anymore. They're like, don't leave us, God. We're the most important. We want you to stay with us. Or maybe there's a kinder way to read that, right? They're really sad at the thought that God is not going to be with them anymore. They would be sad to lose God's presence. And they want God to stay with them. not to leave them, but to stay with them and to continue to be part of their world. And God says, don't worry, I'm going to stay with you. So who wins in that story? If your focus is on who gets the Torah, I mean, no spoilers here. You already knew how that one was going to end. The Jewish people get the Torah, the angels do not get the Torah. But it is interesting, I think, that unlike the stories about creation, it doesn't seem like there's a lot of comfort for the angels in those moments. God doesn't feel like God needs to explain God's self to the angels there. Here God is saying, don't worry, like I really am giving something very important to humans. And also we, the angels and we live together in the heavens, and there's a bond there also that can't be broken. And one final version of this opposition, which I think is yet another angle on the question of what did the angels want and what did we gain? The Gemara in Masechet Shabbat tells an extended story. When Moshe came up to the heavens, again, same deal. The angels get upset and they say, what's he doing here? Like, who let him in? And Moshe says, the Kabel Torah, or actually, sorry, God says to angels about Moshe, he came to get the Torah. Amru lefanav chemda gnuza shegnuza lecha shameot v'shiv'im ve'arba dorot kodem shenivra ha'olam. So here you get the sense of, again, this stashed away Torah. You have this treasure, this hidden treasure that was concealed for 974 generations before the world was even created. You want to give it to human beings? That doesn't seem to us like a good idea. The same verse actually gets quoted from Psalms as is quoted in that earlier midrash we saw about creation. Right? Who are people that you should notice them, right? You, God, are so great. Why would you give it to human beings? Amar lo HaKadosh Baruch Hu LaMoshe. God says to Moshe, like basically like tell him what it's all about, Moshe. Hechzir lahen tshuva, give them an answer. And Moshe actually says, wait, I'm afraid that the angels are going to kill me, that they're going to burn me with the fire of their mouths. And God says, don't worry, hold on to my heavenly throne, which is sort of an aside in this story. But I think, first of all, it ties the story to the Midrashic tradition of, disguising Moses as Abraham. There's another one where God creates an escape tunnel for Moshe, again, to escape for the angels. Right? There's this sense that angels pose a clear and present danger, which is, again, I think, countercultural if you think of angels as, like angelic. Actually, I mean, there's extensive scholarly literature about whether or to what extent in the Talmud demons are distinct from evil angels. It seems that those are two distinct things, and that maybe even in the Torah you can have essentially good angels and bad angels, right? Angels sent to do good things and angels sent to do bad things. See, for example, the Pesach story, where it's clear that there's been an angel sent, an angel of destruction sent, even if not to harm the Jewish people, but there does seem to be this like very terrifying side to angels. I don't want us to lose sight of that as we consider our rivalry, because I think, again, part of the setup at the beginning in the stories about creation was, well, angels are great. People have this like bad aspect, but angels are pretty scary too, right? They have their moments. Anyway, God keeps Moshe from getting shmeiced by the angels, and Moshe is able to give his response, and he essentially goes through like a greatest hits of the Torah. So he says to God, but he's like the straight man, right? Or God is the straight God, whatever, straight man, Ki'ilu. Ribono shel olam, Torah she'atanu tenli, ma k'tiv ba. God, tell me what's in this Torah that you're going to give us. And the first answer is, I am the Lord your God who took you out of the land of Egypt. And so Moses says, when was the last time you were in Egypt, angels? If that story doesn't resonate with you, you're not part of that history. L'paro hishtabadtem, were you servants to Pharaoh? I don't think so. Torah lama tehelachem, why would we give you Torah? It clearly does not apply to you. Which I think is a really powerful moment if you think about it. The definitional moments of Jewish history, certainly in the Ten Commandments, arguably, greatest hits ever, is is the redemption from Egypt. And Moshe is saying, if you weren't part of that, you're really not part of our story. And you angels were kind of like singing on high while that was going on. You can't be part, clearly the Torah was not meant for you. And then Moshe goes on, okay, what else is in the Torah? You can't have any other gods. Lo yeh lecha Elohim acherim. And Moshe says, wait, angels, do you live among people who worship idols? Right? Clearly the answer is no, you do not. And he goes on, Zachor Yom HaShabbat l'kadsho. Remember Shabbat to sanctify it. This might be my favorite one. I taught a class last year with Rabbanit Sara about melacha, about labor on Shabbat. So I think this is my favorite example. Angels, you don't do any work. You can't be told to rest from work on Shabbat if you don't do any work anyway. And on, right? Honor your parents. Well, you don't have parents. All these things about, don't murder and don't commit adultery and don't steal. You guys are incapable of feeling jealousy. You guys don't have a yetzer hara. Yetzer hara yesh beinechem, right? Clearly you have no yetzer hara. And so clearly Moses points out again and again, this Torah, it's just not your book, angels. It was not meant for you. You're not destined for this. And again, what I think is so interesting is the way that this midrash picks up on some of those themes that we saw in the midrashim about creation. Essentially, what the angels were saying in that chesed and emet midrash that we saw is like, wait, people are going to do bad things. People are going to do bad. They're hardwired to do bad things. And Moshe's saying, okay, it's true. We're hardwired to do bad things. And by the way, the Torah is written for people who sometimes do bad things. And not just bad things, but also just normal human things like working and having parents. And all of these things are part of human experience that you, the angels, are excluded from. I don't know about you, but I definitely come out of this Gemara feeling pretty grateful to be a person and not an angel, right? It feels like it's not just a question of like perfection anymore. It's a question of otherworldliness, and we are pretty solidly of this world, and the Torah was destined for this world. So again, I think the question is, or among the questions you could ask here, how does the rivalry between angels and Jewish people impact our relationship to God and the Torah? And what's the value of the argument that we're uniquely suited to the Torah? So that one I already said, but I think that there's something really uplifting about that and something that makes us feel like a really good match for this gift. Noah said, reminds me of how I wanted braces as a kid, even though my teeth were already straight. Not sure which part. I guess, right, that's like sort of what the angels, right? The angels are wanting this Torah, even though it's a corrective to something that they don't lack. I think that's actually a really interesting analogy because, yeah, the angels are in some sense saying, well, this comes from God. This is at least how I'm interpreting the angels. Again, feel free to put comments in the chat if you have them. The angels feel, well, it was this gift, it was hidden away. Surely we are meant to be the recipients of that gift. Like, who's more deserving than we are? But it turns out that if you start out too perfect, then you're not the right address for the Torah, which is in part about perfecting ourselves, but perfecting ourselves within these very human parameters, I would say, right? Within this space of this is what humans are capable of, this is what we can do, this is what we should do. And so given that this is what we're designed for, this is the Torah that was then designed for us in exchange or in response. Pausing to see if there are any other questions or comments before we go on. Okay. So again, there's a significant rivalry around creation. There's a significant rivalry around revelation and this idea that the Jewish people are going to get the Torah. And of course, like I said, it's like a little bit of a spoiler, right? Like, obviously we were always going to get the Torah, or like that's sort of obvious to us. Was it a done deal for the angels? Did they know that they were protesting sort of in vain? I don't know. I think what's fun and dramatic about these stories is that the Midrash and the Gemara respectively set it up as though the angels were really in it to win it, right? That they really thought that maybe they could kick Moshe out of heaven and overcome us and triumph and get the Torah. And of course, Moshe is essentially saying to them, okay, like if you get the Torah, what are you going to do with it, right? It's not really going to help you in any way. But the message is that the Torah is designed for flawed human beings. And as I mentioned, we saw these next two sources last time, but I want to come at them this time from this angle, from this perspective of being created as flawed human beings who, in some sense, let's be honest, I think we won and the angels lost. That we are in some ways superior to them. Oh yeah, Ella is saying perhaps the Melachim and Seraphim innately know the wisdom and laws of the Torah, but Bnei Adam do not have that innate wisdom. I think that's really interesting because I might have expected that to be the argument in the Gemara here, right? Like you already know this, you don't need this. I think Moshe is making a more nuanced argument, which is like it's not even like, oh, you have these mitzvot, you have this wisdom. It's like, it's just in a different place from you. You're in a really different place. You're really different kinds of beings. And we don't even aspire to be, right? I think to me, that's part of the message of this Midrash. If we aspired to be like the angels, we'd say, oh, if only we didn't need the Torah, right? If only we didn't have to have that. If only we didn't need to be created. If only we didn't need the Torah. But I think that's not the message. I think the message is we do need it. And somehow that puts us actually in a better position than the angels. And so if we read these next two sources with that lens, that we kind of won, or we're winning, maybe it's like an ongoing rivalry or battle. But in some sense, I think the rabbinic sources are setting us up as the victors here. So how does that translate to really like the nitty-gritty of halacha? So I don't know who's joining us who was here last time, so I'm going to read this again. I didn't have a lot of time to spend on it last time. This is the Gemara in Brachot, talking about the theme of this section is under what conditions, in what circumstances can a person say Shema, or can a person recite prayers, recite the name of God? In what situation is that okay, and in what situations is that not okay? So it was taught in a Breitza, Mayim Sulin, Yoshev Behen Ad Savaro V'Koreh. If the water is clear, you can sit in it up to your neck and say Shema. V'yesh Omrim Ochran Baraglo. But some people would say, no, you should like use your foot to stir up the dirt at the bottom of, let's say, the lake or whatever, and that way the water will be muddy, and then you should recite Shema. V'tanakama hareli boro et hayarva. But according to the first position, that you can sit even in clear water, the literal phrase here is your heart sees your nakedness, right? Like maybe you're not looking down at your nakedness, but like you are naked, and your body is being exposed to your genitals in some way, and so that's a problem. Kasaver liboro et hayarva mutar. So okay, it must be that Tana, that teacher of the first part of the Breitza, thinks that that's okay. But his right, their heel is seeing their genitals, right? Even as they're crouching down, so their foot is going to be near their genitals. So okay, maybe kasaver akevoro et mutar. So maybe the first Tana thinks that's okay too. But the Gemara kind of digs into this a little bit. Itmar akevoro et mutar. If you think that that's true, that it's okay, if your heel sees your nakedness, to use again the sort of literal translation, Abaye amar asor v'Rava amar mutar. Abaye says, no, you actually can't do that. And Rava says it's permitted. And I'm skipping a little bit, but the Gemara says, well, like, maybe it's a question of, maybe some people would agree that if it's touching, it's a problem for sure. But if it's just that your heel is across from your genitals, then maybe it's okay. And the punchline here, Rava amar mutar, Rava says it's okay. Lo nitna Torah l'malachei hasharet. the Torah wasn't given to ministering angels. When we read this in our last session, I was focusing more on the distinction between human beings and angels, right? This is a way in which we're really different from angels. And I would say maybe this is a little bit also to Yael's point in the chat that the angels, they have certain advantages over us. They maybe innately know things that we need to be taught, and they don't have physical bodies to kind of get in the way of stuff. And I mean that in many ways, right? So first of all, some of our yetzer hara, some of our evil inclinations are like linked to the fact that we have physical bodies. You couldn't ever be a glutton if you didn't get hungry, and presumably angels don't get hungry, but we do. And you couldn't ever cheat on a spouse if you didn't have sexual urges, and presumably angels don't have that, and we do. So there's a way in which this sentence, lo nitna Torah l'malachei sharet, is like a way of being like, all right, like, what can you do, right? We got the Torah, somehow we won, yay. We got the Torah, they didn't get the Torah. Torah was given to us and not to them, and so there must be some way to make it work with our human bodies. I think the other way to read this, which if you want to read a great article on this, my teacher and an amazing professor of Talmud, Christine Hayes, wrote an article about this phrase, lo nitna Torah l'malachei sharet, and she, among others, suggests that there's actually something victorious or she says aspirationalist about this phrase. Again, I see it as kind of the continuation of this little victory dance that we're doing. Okay, we are in some ways, maybe better is not the right word, because, again, I'm sort of struck by Yael's comments about like the maybe innate virtue of angels, but at the very least, to go back to Lily Naz's comments, we are beloved. We are beloved of God. We were chosen, not just chosen among the nations, the way it's sometimes talked about, but really chosen by God to be God's partners in this endeavor of the world and bringing the Torah to the world. And so the fact that we have these bodies isn't like it's not like a concession, like we do mitzvot, somehow we muddle through it even though we have these physical bodies. Actually, Lily Naz just wrote, the impure parts and functions of the human body don't have to have a negative value judgment. We aren't aspiring not to be human. I think that's a great summary of where this Gemara lands us, right? We're not aspiring to not be human. The halacha has to conform to the fact that we are human, because after all, lo nitna Torah l'malachei sharet, like not just, oh, what can we do? We're not angels. No, like there was a real moment of choice. The angels tried to grab the Torah from us. The angels tried to stop us from getting the Torah. There's like a drama there. There's a narrative arc. And at the end of the day, lo nitna Torah l'malachei sharet. It wasn't the angels that got the Torah. We got the Torah, and that's inherently a celebration of who we are as human beings, including, as Lily Naz said, including our bodies. And that means that halakha has to take that into account. Halakha doesn't just have to take it into account. Halakha is designed to take that into account. And if you come up against a halakha that doesn't seem designed to take that into account, well, I think Rava at least would say you're doing it wrong, because that's literally how the halakha was intended. That's literally whom the Torah was intended for. There's a few other instances of this. I particularly like this one from the Gemara in Me'ilah, which is like a little more involved. That's why I started with the brachot one, but I like it also. The Gemara is talking about the Masechet is called Me'ilah, and the Gemara is talking about Me'ilah, which is misuse of consecrated temple property. So basically, once something is consecrated to the temple, you really can't use it for any other purpose. And if you do, you transgress this prohibition against Me'ilah. And so it doesn't really matter. Okay, the setup here is hekdesh shaveh maneh shechilo shaveh prutza mechulal. You can redeem consecrated property worth 100 dinars if it's redeemed for an object worth only 1 prutza, right? You can redeem it for even less than the full value, maybe. But really the focus here, Rav Papa then to justify that says, Hainu tamid zibonin b'chol. This is why we build the temple with non-consecrated materials. Okay, so if you imagine a construction site, There's 1-2 doors down from my house, so I am not having to work very hard to imagine this right now. You have the builders taking the bricks and building up the building. And at some point in the building process, the workers get tired or they take a lunch break and they sit down to rest, and they might sit down on the low brick wall that they just built. If those bricks have already been consecrated to the temple, those workers are now in big trouble. And so Rav Papa says, yeah, you have to build with non-sacred, non-consecrated materials. Why? Because the Torah wasn't given to ministering angels. I like this as a foil for the other example, because it's not just like the physical body as it presents in the world. It's also what it means to have a physical body. Like those examples I gave earlier. Part of what it means to have a physical body is you have physical desires, but it also means you have real physical limitations. You can only build for just so long before you have to sit down and rest. There are 613 mitzvot. That's a lot of mitzvot. You could have said, well, the angels would be like a more natural destination for that massive project, because the angels would never get tired. But no, the Torah was given to human beings. The Torah was given to the Jewish people so that we could find a way to deploy halakha in our world while taking into account our physicality. It's our physicality, somehow, it's the very act of creating us that gives God this special bond with us, right? God chose to create us over the objections of the angels, and God chose to give us the Torah over the objections of the angels. So I think, again, I'll ask this question in case anyone wants to share anything. How are we positioned vis-a-vis the angels? But especially, what are the advantages or disadvantages of our role as compared to theirs? And I think that that's very important for considering a kind of religious mission. I mentioned at the beginning of our time together tonight that the word malach, angel, maybe comes from the root of melacha, of labor, to reflect the idea that angels have a mission in the world. People also have a mission in the world. And I think that that comes through really clearly in the kind of the aggregate of these sources, that there's something for us to strive for that isn't about perfection. It's about living the best life we possibly can. It's about keeping halacha and knowing that it's precisely our physical bodies, it's precisely our limitations, it's precisely being human that gives us the opportunity to carry out those mitzvot. And those preachy, goody-goody angels who are kind of jealous or protective of their own perfection, they're our foils. We have the capacity for things that they don't have the capacity for. And again, that doesn't mean that we never imitate the angels. It doesn't mean that the angels don't have a role to play in our lives. But it means that we don't have angelic perfection, or the ideal of angelic perfection, as kind of like an out when we think about who we can be in the world, right? We don't get to say, well, what do you want from me? I'm not an angel. No. There was never a havamina, never a thought, it seems, right? God didn't really seriously consider giving the Torah to the angels. It was destined for us, for all of those, however many generations, 974, I think it was, that God stashed the Torah away. God was waiting for the chance to give it to the Jewish people. And that leaves us with a very, I think, strong sense of mission and calling that maybe goes beyond, at least the rabbinic imagination, of what an angel could be called to do. Before we wrap up for the night, and again, I welcome any of your comments, questions, etc. in the chat. I want to just set us up for next week's class, because there's another realm in which the rabbinic sources describe a kind of competition. Here, I would say there's a competition, but there's also there's an interplay. Like we are competitors and also in some ways in it with the angels, and that is tefillah, that's prayer. And so the Gemara in Chulin says, Chavivin Yisrael lifnei HaKadosh Baruch Hu yoter mimalachei hasharet. Well, in case you thought I was making it up, here it is straight out. The Jewish people are more beloved by God than the angels. Why? Shisrael omrim shira b'chol sha'ah. Malachei Hasharet ein omrim shira ela pam achat bayom. Because the Jewish people can recite, or maybe do recite, songs of praise to God all the time, every time of day. And the ministering angels only say it once a day. Ve'amri la pam achat b'Shabbat, or maybe even they only say it once a week, right? They pray even less than that. Ve'amri la pam achat b'chodesh, or maybe they only pray once a month. Ve'amri la pam achat b'shana, or maybe they only pray once a year. Okay, you get the idea. And maybe once every 7 years, maybe once every Jubilee, right? Once every 50 years, maybe once only in the history of the world. So, okay, long story short, we pray more than they do, and we get credit for that. And Yisrael mazkirin et Hashem achar shtei tevot. This is a little technical, to work with me, but the Jewish people say God's name after two, like as the second word, after two words, right? Shema Yisrael, Hashem Elokeinu. So it only takes us 2 words to like get to the good stuff and start talking about God. But the angels, their prayer is different. What do they say? Kadosh, 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 Hashem Tzvakot. It takes them 3 words to get to God's name. And so we are more beloved in that sense. And one more, like, final point here, in case you weren't getting it, the angels can't actually say their shira, they can't even say their prayer until up above, lamala, until the Jewish people say their prayer below. And there's a proof text from Eov that actually, right, we pray first, and that sort of gives permission to the angels to pray, and only at that moment can their prayer happen. So there's a kind of again, I want to say there is a way in which we're working in concert with the angels. We're praying and they're praying, but our prayer is superior. It's more frequent. It mentions God faster. There's a closeness there to God, and they have to wait for us in order to pray. And what I want to talk about next time is to more fully expand on the complicated role that angels play in prayer. Both this, they're sort of hanging out, they're listening to our prayers, but also maybe they're conveying our prayers. And also, sometimes we pray to angels. Sometimes angels are involved in what I would call intercessionary prayer. And that's really interesting, especially given everything that we just talked about. Do the angels even want to convey our prayers, first of all, right? Like, how friendly are they really? How good are they at conveying our prayers? And also, I think, given this intense focus on the closeness between human beings and God, right? The ways in which God has kind of chosen us, in a sense, over the angels. What's really the advantage of involving the angels in the prayer scene? And the truth is that this idea of the angels up in heaven, kind of, fighting against us, trying to keep us from being created, trying to keep the Torah from themselves, all of these things, that's part of a vision of angels. But there's also a sense that they're very involved with human life. They're up in heaven, so they are closer to God. They can maybe, again, sort of transmit our prayers or be involved in the prayer process, but they're also kind of hanging out with us in some ways. And maybe that also makes them good transmitters of prayer, good kind of messengers to the divine and not just from the divine. So that's something that we'll explore next time we speak. I hope that you'll all come back next week. Really, I think that the intercessionary prayer is my favorite part of the whole conversation. And I want to just encourage you again, if you think of your favorite rabbinic story, Talmudic story, poetry, Jewish or not, Hebrew or English, or any other language, but those are the only languages that I speak, or song lyrics, or anything else that has to do with angels, please feel free to add it to the angel graffiti sheet. I think I'm going to wind up putting a whole bunch of sources there that don't actually make it into my source sheet for next week, because I have way too much for an hour already, and it's still a week away. So please go ahead and feel free to do that. And please feel free to reach out to me if you have any questions in the interim. And we will stop there, I think, exactly at time. So thank you all so much. This was a lot of fun, and I hope to see you back next week.
Thank you so much, Rabbanit Sara. I feel so much more connected and entitled to my share in Torah now, and thank you to all of our participants on Zoom and also on Facebook and people watching later. Thank you so much, and see you all next week.